Welcome. Wherever you are listening from tonight, allow yourself to slow down. Let the room stay dark. Let the day settle quietly behind you. There is nothing you need to focus on, nothing you need to remember, and nothing you need to stay awake for. This story will unfold gently, and you are free to rest whenever sleep arrives. Tonight's story takes place in a quiet neighborhood, a residential street, a familiar house, an ordinary night that did not announce what was about to be lost. This is the story of the Springfield Three. In the early hours of a summer morning in 1992, 3 women disappeared from a home in Springfield, Missouri. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no disturbed rooms, no witnesses who heard anything unusual. The house did not look like the scene of a crime. It looked like a place where life had simply paused. The disappearance was not discovered by police. It was discovered by friends. Phone calls went unanswered. Plans were missed. Concern grew slowly, without alarm at first. Nothing about the situation suggested danger, and yet something was undeniably wrong. What makes this story unsettling is not what was found, but what was not. No struggle, no evidence of violence, no clear moment where things changed. The women did not leave behind explanations. They did not take personal belongings. Their cars remained. Their purses were still inside the house. Everything suggested that they expected to return, or perhaps never intended to leave at all. This was not a disappearance marked by chaos. It was marked by quiet. The neighborhood slept through it. The streetlights continued to glow. The house stood unchanged. Whatever happened did so without urgency, without noise, and without interruption. This story is told slowly and calmly. There is no music, no sudden sounds, no moments meant to shock. You do not need to follow every detail. You do not need to hold the timeline in your mind. Let the narration move gently around you, like background thought. If your mind wanders, let it wander. If your eyes grow heavy, let them close. The story will continue whether you are awake or asleep. The house remains, the night remains, and the questions remain, resting quietly where answers never arrived. You are safe where you are, the room is still, and the story can begin. In the early 1990s, Springfield was a place defined by routine. It sat quietly in the southwest of Missouri, far from the pace of major cities, shaped by familiarity rather than anonymity. People knew their neighbors. Streets were recognizable. Life moved predictably, anchored by work schedules, school calendars, and weekend gatherings. There was a sense of safety woven into daily life. Homes were close together. Front porches faced the street. Children moved freely between houses. It was common for doors to remain unlocked during the day, sometimes even at night. Danger was something that happened elsewhere, not in familiar neighborhoods where people had lived for years. The city itself was not isolated, but it was contained. Springfield was large enough to feel active, yet small enough that unusual events traveled quickly through conversation rather than headlines. When something went wrong, people talked about it quietly, often assuming there was a simple explanation waiting to surface. Neighborhoods like the one where this story unfolds were especially calm. Residential streets curved gently, lined with modest houses and trimmed lawns. Streetlights cast soft pools of light after dark. Traffic slowed in the evenings, and by late night, most homes were silent. In 1992, technology had not yet altered how people stayed connected. There were no mobile phones in every pocket, no constant location tracking. Communication happened through landlines, answering machines, and face-to-face conversation. If someone did not answer the phone, it was usually assumed they were busy, asleep, or away briefly. This absence of constant contact shaped expectations. Silence did not immediately signal alarm. A missed call was not urgent. A delayed response did not feel threatening. People trusted that things would resume as normal. Graduation season added to this sense of routine. Late May and early June were filled with celebrations, visits, and last-minute plans. Young people stayed out late. Families adjusted to changing schedules. Nothing about these nights felt unusual or dangerous. It was within this atmosphere of familiarity that the disappearance occurred. There were no warning signs embedded in the city itself. No pattern of violence that suggested risk. Crime existed, as it does everywhere, but it did not dominate attention or define behavior. People moved through their days with confidence that home was a place of safety. This context matters, because when 3 women vanished from a house without signs of force or struggle, the city was not prepared to recognize it as a crime immediately. The environment had taught people to expect explanations, not disappearances. The streets did not change overnight. The routines continued. Life carried on quietly. Springfield did not feel like the setting for a mystery. It felt like the kind of place where things made sense, where events followed patterns, and where people returned home at the end of the day. That expectation lingered in the air when the house was later found silent. The city itself had not changed, but something within it had quietly slipped out of place. And in a town built on familiarity and trust, that absence would take time to be understood for what it truly was. To understand the disappearance that would later be known as the Springfield Three, it is necessary to understand the women themselves, not as figures in a mystery, but as people living ordinary lives on the edge of change. Each of them occupied a different place in life, and yet, on one quiet night, their paths converged in a way that would never be fully explained. Suzanne Streeter was 19 years old. She had just graduated from Kickapoo High School and was standing at the threshold of adulthood. Friends described her as creative and expressive, someone who enjoyed writing and art. She had a wide social circle and moved easily between groups, comfortable both at home and out with friends. Graduation represented possibility for her, not closure. She was making plans, thinking forward, and looking ahead to what might come next. Suzanne lived with her mother, Sherrill Levitt, in a modest home on East Delmar Street. Sherrill was 47 years old, practical, steady, and deeply rooted in routine. She worked as a cosmetologist, a profession that required trust and conversation, and she was known for her warmth and reliability. Clients returned to her not only for haircuts, but for familiarity. She had built a life defined by consistency and care. Sherrill's home reflected that stability. It was tidy, comfortable, and welcoming. Friends of Suzanne often spent time there, and Sherrill was accustomed to young people coming and going. The house was not guarded or formal. It was open in the way many family homes were at the time, shaped by trust rather than caution. The third woman, Stacy McCall, was also 19 and a close friend of Suzanne. Like her, Stacy had just graduated high school. She was described as gentle, thoughtful, and dependable. She had a steady relationship with her boyfriend and a close bond with her family. That night was meant to be a celebration, a moment marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The connection between the 3 women was simple and unremarkable. They were not bound by secrecy or conflict. They were connected by routine relationships, family ties, and ordinary friendship. There was no known tension between them, no unresolved disputes, no sense that any of them felt unsafe or unsettled. What is striking in retrospect is how grounded their lives were. Suzanne was preparing for the future. Stacy was surrounded by family and stability. Sherrill was firmly established in her community. None of them were transient. None of them were disconnected. None of them were disappearing from the edges of society. They were present, visible, and accounted for, until suddenly they were not. On the night they vanished, there was nothing exceptional about their plans. The evening unfolded through small decisions and casual adjustments. Graduation parties shifted. Arrangements changed, the kind of changes that happened without consequence on countless other nights. And yet, those ordinary choices led them back to the house on East Delmar Street. It was a familiar place, a place associated with safety, comfort, and rest. There was no reason to believe that entering it would mark the end of contact with the outside world. What makes this disappearance so unsettling is not only that 3 women vanished, but that they did so from the center of their lives. They did not walk away from responsibilities. They did not abandon belongings. They did not signal departure. Everything suggested continuity, not escape. Friends and family would later struggle with this reality. They searched for meaning in personalities, habits, and relationships, hoping to find something that explained what happened, but nothing in the women's lives pointed toward disappearance. There were no warning signs hiding in plain sight. They were ordinary people living ordinary days, and that ordinariness is what gives the case its lasting weight. It reminds us that mysteries do not always emerge from chaos or isolation. Sometimes they emerge from stability, from places where nothing was supposed to go wrong. The women were not defined by the mystery when they were alive. They were daughters, friends, and neighbors. They were moving forward, not away. And whatever happened to them did not begin with secrecy or fear. It began with familiarity, with trust, and with a door that did not need to be forced open. That quiet beginning would shape everything that followed. Graduation night in Springfield unfolded the way it had for countless classes before. It was warm, unhurried, and full of small celebrations that did not feel significant while they were happening. Families gathered, friends moved from house to house. Plans shifted easily, shaped more by mood than by schedule. Suzanne Streeter and Stacy McCall spent the evening attending graduation parties with friends. There was laughter, conversation, and the sense of release that comes after a long chapter closes. Nothing about the night suggested risk or discomfort. It was the kind of evening people remember fondly, not cautiously. As the night progressed, arrangements changed casually. At one point, Suzanne and Stacy planned to stay at a friend's house. Later, that plan shifted. The house became crowded. Sleeping space grew limited. Rather than forcing the situation, they decided to leave and go somewhere quieter. The decision was unremarkable. They chose to return to Suzanne's home, where her mother, Sherrill Levitt, was already there. It was a familiar place, nearby, and comfortable. The choice was practical, not impulsive. There was no sense of urgency, no pressure from outside forces. It was simply where they expected to rest before the next day began. The drive back was short. Streets were calm. The city was settling into late-night stillness. By the time they arrived, it was already early morning, but not unusually late for a graduation celebration. Lights were off in neighboring houses. The night felt ordinary. Inside the home, there were signs of normal activity. Purses were set down, shoes were removed, personal items were left where they would usually be left. Nothing suggested a hurried arrival or a sudden disturbance. The house did not look like a place where something had gone wrong. It looked like a place where people had arrived and expected to stay. Sherrill was home when they returned. There is no indication of tension or surprise. Suzanne had come home late many times before. Friends staying over was not unusual. The household was accustomed to flexibility, especially on nights like this. Phone calls made earlier in the evening were returned. Messages were left casually. There was no sense of finality in any interaction. No goodbye that carried weight. Everything pointed toward continuity. At some point, the house grew quiet. Lights were turned off. The night deepened. The neighborhood slept. Whatever happened next did not announce itself. It did not wake the street. It did not draw attention. It did not leave a clear moment to point back to. Graduation night ended the way nights usually end. Not with noise, not with conflict, but with rest. This ordinariness would later become difficult to accept. Investigators and families would return to this night again and again, searching for a moment where something shifted, a decision that mattered, a sign that danger had entered the picture. But graduation night did not offer such a moment. It flowed gently into morning, carrying nothing that demanded explanation. The women did not disappear from a party, a bar, or a public place. They vanished from a home they trusted, after a night that felt safe enough to forget as soon as it ended. And that is what makes the night so unsettling. There was no threshold crossed that anyone noticed, no warning sound, no disruption to mark the transition from ordinary life into absence. Graduation night passed quietly, and in its stillness, something irreversible took place without leaving behind the kind of moment people are taught to watch for. The last known movements of the three women are defined not by certainty, but by the gradual narrowing of possibilities. Unlike many disappearances, there is no single moment where events clearly turned. Instead, there is a quiet tapering, a point where ordinary actions simply stop leaving traces. After leaving the final graduation party, Suzanne Streeter and Stacy McCall drove back to Suzanne's home on East Delmar Street. The trip was short and familiar. There were no reports of their car being followed, no unusual sightings, and no known encounters along the way. The drive itself appears uneventful, absorbed into the background of a quiet, early morning. Their arrival at the house marks the last confirmed moment when all three women were together. Sherrill Levitt was already home. The house showed no indication of disturbance upon entry. Doors were not forced. Windows were intact. Everything suggested a normal return rather than an interruption. What is striking about this point in the timeline is how little exists beyond it. There are no confirmed phone calls made after their arrival. No neighbors recall hearing voices, vehicles, or unusual sounds. No one reports seeing anyone enter or leave the house during the night or early morning hours. The answering machine becomes part of the story here, not for what it recorded, but for what it did not preserve. Incoming messages were later reported, but they were erased before they could be examined by investigators. At the time, this action did not seem significant. It was done casually, without the awareness that it would later erase one of the last potential records of outside contact. The women's personal belongings remained inside the house. Purses were left behind. Keys were present. Clothing and cosmetics suggested they had settled in for the night rather than preparing to leave again. Their cars were parked outside. Nothing indicated plans to go elsewhere. This detail has remained one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. People do not usually leave without essentials. They do not abandon vehicles and personal items unless departure is unexpected, interrupted, or coerced. And yet, there was no evidence of force. The lack of forced entry is not simply a technical observation. It reshapes every possible explanation. Whoever entered the home, if anyone did, was either known to the women, allowed inside voluntarily, or gained access in a way that left no trace. Each possibility narrows the scope of what could have happened, while simultaneously making it more difficult to prove. The house itself offers no clear answers. There were no signs of a struggle. Furniture was undisturbed. Nothing appeared broken or displaced. The scene did not suggest panic or resistance. If something occurred, it did so quietly and efficiently. As morning approached, the women should have resumed contact with the world. Plans had been made. People expected to hear from them. When phone calls went unanswered and no one arrived where they were expected, concern began to surface slowly. At first it was mild, then it grew heavier. The last known movements, when viewed in isolation, feel incomplete. They describe arrival, not departure, presence, not absence. The story pauses rather than ends. Investigators would later return to this moment, repeatedly, hoping to extract meaning from what was not recorded. They mapped timelines, re-examined assumptions, and considered alternative paths, but the boundary remained fixed. The women were last known to be inside a house that showed no sign of intrusion, in a neighborhood that did not notice anything unusual, on a night that did not announce danger. And then, without sound or signal, the record stops. The last known movements do not explain what happened. They only confirm where certainty ends. Beyond that point, the story becomes defined not by action, but by silence. The morning after graduation night began without alarm. The sun rose over Springfield, as it always did, and the neighborhood on East Delmar Street remained quiet. Nothing about the house suggested absence from the outside. The cars were still parked where they had been left. Curtains hung undisturbed. The street carried the ordinary sounds of a weekend morning. Concern did not arrive suddenly. It crept in slowly. Friends expected to hear from Suzanne Streeter and Stacy McCall. Plans had been made. Calls were placed. When the phone rang without answer, it was not immediately alarming. Late nights often led to late mornings. Silence still felt explainable. As the hours passed, the lack of response began to feel heavier. Calls continued. Messages were left still. There was no reply. Eventually, a friend decided to go to the house to check on them, assuming something simple had delayed communication. When she arrived, the first thing she noticed was that nothing looked wrong. The front door was unlocked. This was not unusual. Inside, the house felt lived in, not abandoned. Shoes were near the door. Purses rested where they had been placed. The television was present. Furniture sat exactly as expected. There was no immediate sense of intrusion or disorder. Calling out into the house brought no response. At first, this still did not signal danger. People sleep late. Doors are closed. Rooms remain quiet. The house did not feel threatening. It felt paused. As more friends arrived, they moved through the rooms, checking bedrooms and common areas. Personal items remained untouched. Makeup bags were still there. Clothing lay folded or draped casually. Everything suggested that the women had gone to bed and planned to wake up again. One detail felt off. The answering machine contained messages, but they had been erased. This was discovered unintentionally. Someone pressed play out of habit and found nothing recorded. At the time, this seemed insignificant. People erased messages regularly. No one imagined this would later represent the loss of a critical piece of information. The women's purses were still inside the house. This detail began to shift concern into something more serious. Purses carried essentials: wallets, identification, money, keys. People did not leave without them unless they expected to return quickly or were prevented from taking them. And yet, there was no sign that the women had left voluntarily. Friends began to feel uneasy. They searched the house again, more carefully this time. Bedrooms were empty. Bathrooms showed no signs of use that morning. The sense of normalcy began to feel unnatural, like a stage set left behind after the actors had gone. Eventually, police were contacted. When officers arrived, they approached the situation cautiously. At first glance, the scene did not resemble a crime. There was no forced entry, no visible damage, no indication of violence. The house appeared exactly as it should have after a late night. This created hesitation. In the early hours of response, the disappearance did not immediately register as an abduction. Officers considered the possibility that the women had left voluntarily, perhaps to avoid plans or to continue the night elsewhere. The lack of immediate evidence made it difficult to treat the house as a crime scene. This delay would later weigh heavily on the case. Friends continued to move through the house while waiting for clarity. Items were touched. Doors were opened. The answering machine had already been cleared. These actions were not careless. They were human. No one understood what was unfolding. As the realization set in that the women were truly missing, the atmosphere changed. What had felt like a delay now felt like absence. The house no longer felt paused. It felt empty. Police began documenting the scene more formally. They noted the lack of forced entry. They noted the untouched belongings. They noted the quietness. Still, there was nothing concrete to anchor an investigation. The morning discovery did not provide answers. It removed assumptions. The women had not left for work. They had not gone to visit friends. They had not taken their belongings. And yet, they were gone. By midday, the story spread beyond the house. Concern reached family members. Worry turned into fear. The calm of the morning gave way to the weight of uncertainty. The house on East Delmar Street stood unchanged, holding everything except the people who gave it life. The morning discovery marked the moment when ordinary absence became extraordinary silence. It was the point at which explanation failed, and the unknown settled in quietly, without resistance. Nothing had been broken. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had announced itself. And still, 3 lives had slipped out of reach, leaving behind a house that looked exactly as it should have, and a question that would never stop echoing. The morning had revealed not what happened, but what had vanished. Once police began to look more closely at the home on East Delmar Street, the absence of disturbance became the most striking feature. It was not just that there were no signs of forced entry, it was that the house appeared settled, as though the night had ended normally and morning had simply failed to arrive for the people inside. The front door showed no damage. Locks were intact. Windows were closed and unbroken. There was no indication that anyone had entered or exited in a way that required force. For investigators, this immediately narrowed the field of possibilities. Whoever entered the house, if anyone did, either did so with permission or left no trace at all. Inside, the rooms felt lived in. Furniture was arranged normally. Nothing appeared overturned or displaced. Surfaces held everyday items in casual order. The house did not look like a place where fear or urgency had passed through. It looked like a place where people had been comfortable enough to leave things as they were. Personal belongings were everywhere. Purses belonging to Suzanne and Stacy were found inside the house, containing wallets, identification, and money. This detail carried weight. People rarely leave home without these items, unless they expect to return quickly. Their presence suggested that departure, if it occurred, was not planned. Clothing and personal items further reinforced this impression. Makeup bags were still there. Shoes were set aside. No packed bags were found. No signs suggested that anyone had prepared to leave for an extended period. Everything pointed toward an ordinary night, followed by an unexpected interruption. The bedrooms offered no clarity. Beds were unmade, consistent with use, but not disturbed in a way that suggested a struggle. There were no torn sheets, no broken furniture, no marks that hinted at resistance. The quietness of the rooms felt unnatural only in retrospect. At the time, they simply looked like rooms waiting to be reoccupied. The bathroom showed signs of normal use. Nothing appeared out of place. There was no indication that anyone had rushed or acted under stress. Even small details, like items left on counters, suggested routine rather than disruption. One of the most discussed details inside the house was the answering machine. Messages had been received overnight, but they were erased before police could listen to them. This action was not suspicious in itself. People routinely cleared messages without listening closely, especially when checking for missed calls. At the time, no one realized that these recordings might represent the last external contact with the women. The loss of those messages would later loom large. Inside the kitchen, there were no signs of a late-night disturbance. No broken glass, no spilled food. Nothing suggested confrontation. The house did not carry the subtle disorder that often follows unexpected events. It felt paused rather than disrupted. Investigators searched for anything that might indicate coercion or deception. There were no notes left behind, no written messages, no signs of binding or restraint, no evidence of sedatives or substances that might have been used to incapacitate the women. The absence of these details did not provide reassurance. It deepened uncertainty. The house resisted interpretation. Every explanation struggled against the same problem. If the women left voluntarily, why leave belongings behind? If they were forced to leave, why was there no evidence of force? If someone they knew entered the house, why was there no trace of that interaction? The idea that the women might have opened the door willingly became central. The lack of damage suggested familiarity, trust. But even this explanation did not fully account for the silence. 3 people leaving together, willingly or not, without sound or struggle, remained difficult to reconcile. As investigators documented each room, they noted how little there was to document. There were no dramatic clues, no obvious mistakes, no clear path forward. The house offered context, but not answers. It showed how the women lived, but not how they left. This stillness would define the case. The house became a symbol not of violence, but of absence. A place where everything remained except the people themselves. A space that held belongings, routines, and traces of ordinary life, but no explanation for why that life had stopped. Inside the house, time appeared to have stalled, and in that stalled moment, investigators found themselves facing a mystery that did not announce itself loudly enough to be understood, only quietly enough to endure. When police first became involved in the disappearance, the situation did not immediately present itself as a crime. Officers arriving at the house on East Delmar Street were met with a scene that looked ordinary, even peaceful. There were no visible signs of forced entry, no damage to doors or windows, and no evidence of violence. In the early hours, this absence shaped every decision that followed. At the time, it was not uncommon for adults to be temporarily out of contact. Late nights led to late mornings. Plans changed. Silence did not automatically mean danger. Without clear indicators of a crime, officers approached the situation cautiously, treating it as a missing persons inquiry rather than an emergency abduction. This initial uncertainty slowed the response. The house was not immediately sealed as a crime scene. Friends and family continued to move through it, checking rooms, calling out names, and searching for anything that might explain the absence. These actions were natural and well-intentioned, but they unintentionally altered the environment. Potential evidence was touched, moved, or erased without anyone realizing its future significance. The answering machine messages were already gone by the time police recognized their importance. Whatever voices or sounds they may have contained were lost permanently. At the time, this did not feel like a critical mistake. It felt like routine behavior applied to an ordinary situation. Only later did the weight of that loss become clear. As hours passed and the women did not return, the tone shifted. What had felt like delay began to feel like disappearance. Officers reassessed the scene, now aware that the lack of disturbance itself was unusual. 3 people vanishing without taking belongings, without vehicles, and without explanation did not align with voluntary absence. Still, the lack of physical evidence limited options. There were no clear suspects, no witnesses to question, no signs pointing outward from the house. Police began canvassing the neighborhood, speaking quietly with residents. Most had heard nothing unusual. No late-night arguments, no vehicles speeding away, no unfamiliar faces lingering. The neighborhood's calm remained intact, offering little to work with. The investigation expanded gradually, rather than explosively. Reports were filed, descriptions were circulated. Officers retraced known movements from the previous night. Each step produced more confirmation of absence rather than direction. The women had not been seen leaving. They had not been reported elsewhere. They had simply vanished from one fixed point. Internally, there was growing concern about the early handling of the case. The longer the scene remained uncontrolled, the more opportunities for evidence were lost. Yet even with perfect preservation, investigators would have faced the same fundamental problem. There was nothing obvious to preserve. The early police response was shaped by context. Springfield was not accustomed to crimes of this nature. The idea that 3 women could be taken from a home without noise or force did not fit familiar patterns. The case did not resemble a burglary. It did not resemble domestic violence. It did not resemble a typical missing persons scenario. This unfamiliarity created hesitation. As days passed, pressure increased. Media attention grew. The case shifted from local concern to regional mystery. With that shift came renewed urgency, but the foundation had already been set. The early hours, where clarity might have been established, were gone. Police worked with what they had. They followed tips. They examined rumors. They explored possibilities. But the absence of early physical evidence meant that every lead depended on memory, speculation, or chance. The case became vulnerable to noise rather than clarity. Looking back, the early response is often examined critically. Mistakes are identified, opportunities are questioned, but it is important to understand the environment in which those decisions were made. The scene did not announce danger. The context did not demand urgency. The understanding came later. By the time the case was fully recognized for what it was, the women had already slipped beyond reach. The early police response did not fail because of neglect. It struggled because the crime, if it was one, did not behave like a crime. And in that quiet gap between ordinary absence and irreversible loss, the case took the shape it would never escape. Among the few details that ever hinted at contact from outside the house, the phone messages stand apart, not because of what they revealed, but because they were lost before their importance was understood. In many ways, they represent the fragile boundary between ordinary routine and permanent absence. In the early hours after the women were discovered missing, friends moved through the house, doing what people naturally do when something feels off. They checked rooms, looked for notes, and listened for messages. The answering machine had received calls overnight, but those messages were erased before police arrived. At the time, this action felt harmless. Clearing messages was routine. No one imagined they might hold the last recorded trace of the women's contact with the outside world. Later, it became known that the messages were not ordinary. Friends recalled that several calls had come in during the early morning hours. Some described the voice as male. Others remembered that the tone was strange, possibly inappropriate, though memory blurred with time and stress. Because the recordings were gone, these recollections could never be confirmed or examined closely. This loss changed the course of the investigation, quietly but permanently. Answering machines in the early 1990s captured more than voices. They captured background sounds, pauses, breathing, and tone. Even a few seconds of audio could have provided insight into timing, intent, or identity. Without the recordings, investigators were left with second-hand impressions rather than evidence. Police later attempted to reconstruct what might have been said based on witness memory. But memory is unreliable, especially under emotional strain. Accounts differed, details shifted. What remained consistent was only the sense that the messages felt wrong in hindsight. The timing of the calls mattered. They arrived after the women were last known to be together in the house. That alone suggested the possibility of outside contact during the critical window. Whether the calls were related to the disappearance or merely coincidental could never be determined. The messages might have been meaningless, or they might have been the closest thing to a warning. What deepened the unease was the idea that the calls were not random. Friends believed the caller may have known the women. The familiarity suggested by the tone implied access rather than intrusion. If true, this aligned with the lack of forced entry. Someone may have been close enough to call the house without suspicion. But again, there was no proof. Without the recordings, investigators could not analyze the voice. They could not determine age, accent, or emotional state. They could not assess whether the caller sounded threatening, calm, or casual. The most tangible clue dissolved before it could be examined. The answering machine became a symbol of the case itself. Something had existed briefly. It had been present, and then it was gone. In later years, the phone messages would be referenced often in documentaries, articles, and discussions. They were treated as a lost key, a moment where the story might have turned differently. Yet even this belief rests on assumption. It is possible the messages would have led nowhere. It is possible they would have added confusion rather than clarity. Still, their absence leaves space for imagination. The idea that someone reached out during those hours, leaving behind words that were heard only once and then erased, carries a particular weight. It reinforces how quietly the disappearance unfolded. No alarms, no recorded distress, just routine actions that erased the last fragile thread. The phone remained, the house stayed silent, and the messages faded into memory. What remains is not certainty, but the awareness of how easily crucial moments slip past unnoticed. The phone messages did not announce themselves as important. They became important only after the women did not return, and by then it was already too late to hear what they might have said. As the disappearance of the 3 women settled into prolonged uncertainty, attention slowly shifted toward the people who existed at the edges of their lives. Not because evidence demanded it, but because absence invites speculation. When answers do not emerge, suspicion tends to fill the space quietly, often without direction. Police approached this phase cautiously. There was no crime scene that pointed outward, no forced entry, no signs of struggle, no clear timeline of departure. Without physical evidence, investigators relied on relationships, routines, and proximity. They examined who had access to the house, who knew the women's schedules, and who might have been aware that 2 young women would be staying overnight. Friends, family members, and acquaintances were interviewed extensively. These conversations were not driven by accusation, but by elimination. Investigators looked for inconsistencies, changes in behavior, or details that did not align. For the most part, what they found was normalcy. People's accounts matched expectations. Alibis held. Nothing rose above quiet scrutiny. One individual who received attention was Janelle Kirby, a close friend who had been among the first to notice something was wrong. She had been present at the house the following morning and had erased the answering machine messages. Though this action would later be viewed with regret, it was never considered malicious. She cooperated fully and remained consistent in her account. Investigators found no reason to suspect her involvement. Another name that surfaced over time was Bart Streeter, Suzanne's father. As with many cases involving missing family members, scrutiny extended toward immediate relatives. His movements were examined, his statements reviewed. Ultimately, there was no evidence linking him to the disappearance, and he was not considered a suspect. The attention reflected process rather than suspicion. There were also individuals outside the immediate circle who attracted interest, often due to behavior or proximity rather than proof. Tips came in from the public, some naming people who lived nearby, others pointing to individuals with criminal histories. These tips were investigated quietly, often resulting in dead ends. One figure who drew particular attention over the years was Robert Craig Cox, a convicted criminal who had lived in the area and later made unsettling statements about knowing details of the case. His comments were vague and inconsistent. While troubling, they did not provide verifiable information. Investigators were unable to substantiate his claims, and no charges were brought. Another individual occasionally mentioned was Garrison Turner, whose name surfaced through rumor rather than evidence. As with many names raised in unsolved cases, speculation outpaced fact. Investigators followed leads where possible, but no connection could be established. Throughout this period, police remained aware of a central limitation. Suspicion without evidence does not become resolution. Every person of interest remained just that, a possibility shaped by circumstance rather than proof. What made this phase especially difficult was the absence of a clear starting point. There was no moment of entry to trace, no confirmed interaction to follow, no object or witness that pointed decisively toward another person. The house itself suggested familiarity. If someone else had been involved, it likely would have been someone the women trusted enough to open the door for. This narrowed the field, but it did not identify a name. Trust is broad. Access can be invisible. Over time, suspicion softened into something quieter. Rather than focusing on individuals, investigators began to consider scenarios. How someone might enter without force. How 3 people could be compelled to leave without sound. How fear or deception might operate in silence rather than violence. This shift did not bring clarity, but it reduced noise. The case did not accumulate strong suspects. It accumulated questions. Each person examined and cleared reinforced the same unsettling reality. Whatever happened did not leave behind a human outline that could be easily traced. Years passed, names faded, rumors lost urgency. What remained was a pattern of quiet suspicion without destination. The absence of arrests did not indicate lack of effort. It reflected the nature of the disappearance itself. It did not behave like a crime that wanted to be solved. It left no trail that led outward. And so, the case entered a long period where suspicion existed without accusation, and interest lingered without conclusion. The people around the women continued their lives under the shadow of unanswered questions. Investigators continued to listen, evaluate, and wait, and the disappearance remained exactly what it had been from the beginning. 3 people gone. No clear hand behind it. Only the quiet weight of uncertainty, resting where answers never arrived. As time moved forward and evidence failed to surface, the case of the Springfield Three entered a space shaped not by facts, but by careful consideration. Investigators, journalists, and those closest to the women began to explore theories, not as answers, but as ways to understand how such a disappearance could occur without leaving a trace. One possibility, considered early, was voluntary departure. This idea emerged not because it fit the evidence well, but because it offered a simple explanation for absence. Over time, it became increasingly difficult to support. The women left behind purses, identification, money, and vehicles. They did not take clothing or personal items. There was no indication of preparation or intent to disappear. Voluntary departure did not align with the practical realities of their lives. Another theory focused on opportunistic abduction. This suggested that someone may have encountered the women by chance, taking advantage of circumstance rather than planning. Yet this idea struggled against the same barrier faced by many others. There were no signs of forced entry. No neighbors reported noise or confrontation. The setting did not suggest surprise or chaos. Attention then shifted toward the possibility of deception, rather than force. Someone may have used authority or familiarity to gain compliance. This could explain the lack of disturbance. If the women believed they were cooperating with someone they trusted or perceived as legitimate, resistance may not have occurred. This theory remained speculative, but it accounted for silence better than violence. The idea that the women knew the person who entered the house gained traction over time. Trust can lower defenses more effectively than threats. Familiarity can open doors without question. Yet even this explanation left gaps. No relationship emerged that clearly connected all 3 women to a single individual capable of orchestrating such an event. Some investigators considered the house itself as the focal point. The women did not vanish from a public place. They vanished from a private space where expectations of safety were strongest. This raised the possibility that the event was tied to the location rather than the individuals. Someone may have known the house was occupied. Someone may have known who was inside. There were also theories involving multiple people. The idea that more than one individual could have been involved helped explain how 3 adults might be controlled quietly. But again, evidence did not support coordination or movement. No vehicles were reported. No witnesses observed activity consistent with multiple participants. Over time, theories expanded outward. Some speculated about organized crime or human trafficking. These ideas were explored cautiously and often dismissed due to lack of supporting evidence. There were no known connections, no financial indicators, no communication trails. The theories persisted mostly because of the scale of the disappearance rather than the details of the case. Others considered the possibility of an accidental event followed by concealment. This theory suggested that something went wrong inside the house and was then covered up. But investigators found no physical evidence to support an accident. No blood, no signs of injury, no traces consistent with cleanup. The house did not tell that story. What all theories shared was limitation. Each explained one aspect while leaving others unresolved. Silence fit deception. Lack of force fit familiarity. Absence of belongings fit interruption. But no single theory held everything together. As years passed, the case became defined less by what might have happened and more by what did not. No ransom demands were made. No credible sightings were confirmed. No remains were found. The disappearance did not evolve. It remained static. This lack of progression influenced how theories were treated. Rather than narrowing, they softened. Investigators stopped pushing for one explanation over another. They acknowledged uncertainty openly. The goal shifted from resolution to preservation. Theories became tools for understanding rather than conclusions to be reached. In the absence of answers, restraint became necessary. Accusations without proof could cause harm. Speculation could distort memory. The case demanded care, not certainty. And so, the theories remain where they began. Possible, incomplete, quiet. They sit beside one another, none rising above the rest. Each offering a lens, but no clarity. Each shaped by the same unyielding fact. 3 women disappeared from a house that did not announce their departure. And no theory, no matter how carefully constructed, has yet been able to explain how that silence came to be. As weeks turned into months, and months into years, the disappearance of the 3 women settled into a different kind of presence. It was no longer an active emergency, but it was not forgotten either. It became something quieter, something that existed in the background of daily life, returning in moments of reflection and anniversaries rather than headlines. In the early years, searches continued with determination. Volunteers walked wooded areas. Flyers were posted. Tips were followed. Each new lead carried a brief surge of hope before fading into uncertainty. Nothing concrete emerged. No confirmed sightings. No physical evidence. The case did not move forward. It simply remained. Families lived within this stillness. They waited without timelines. They adjusted without closure. Birthdays passed. Holidays arrived and left again. Life continued in fragments, shaped by the knowledge that something essential was missing but undefined. There was no moment where grief could fully settle, because there was no confirmation of loss. Media attention rose and fell over time. Occasionally, the case resurfaced through documentaries or renewed appeals. Each resurgence brought brief focus, followed by quiet again. The story did not lend itself to dramatic updates. There were no arrests to report, no discoveries to explain. Silence became the most consistent element. Law enforcement did not close the case. Files remained open. Tips were still received. Investigators changed over the years, each inheriting the same unanswered questions. New perspectives were applied, but the foundation remained unchanged. Without new evidence, progress was limited. The passage of time did not clarify. It complicated. The house on East Delmar Street changed hands. New residents moved in. The neighborhood continued its routines. Children grew older. Streets were repaved. Yet for those who remembered, the address carried weight. It became a place associated not with violence, but with absence. A reminder that something could vanish without altering the space it left behind. As the years stretched on, the case entered collective memory rather than active investigation. People spoke about it in careful tones. It was referenced rather than explained. The lack of resolution made it fragile, something to be handled gently. Silence shaped perception. Without answers, speculation softened. Accusations faded. What remained was a shared acknowledgement that the truth might never be known. This acceptance did not come suddenly. It arrived slowly, shaped by time rather than decision. The women did not become distant figures. They remained present in photographs, in recollections, in the way families spoke about them. Their lives did not collapse into the moment of disappearance. They continued to be remembered as they were before it happened, grounded in ordinary moments rather than mystery. Years of silence did not erase the case. They preserved it. The absence became part of its identity, defining how it was understood and how it was carried forward. It was not loud enough to demand resolution, but not quiet enough to disappear. In the end, the years did not answer the question of what happened. They changed the question itself. It became less about how the women vanished, and more about how people live with uncertainty when it refuses to resolve. The silence did not close the story. It became the story. And in that silence, the disappearance remained suspended, unchanged by time, waiting without expectation, held gently in memory rather than conclusion. When investigators and families reached the limits of evidence, attention naturally turned toward the unknown presence that may have entered the women's lives during the final hours. This was not an attempt to assign blame, but an effort to imagine how 3 people could vanish from a familiar home without leaving a trace. The question was not who committed a crime, but who might have crossed their path. The house itself suggests that if someone else was involved, the encounter did not begin with fear. There were no signs of forced entry, no disturbance that suggested surprise or resistance. This implies that whoever came to the door, if anyone did, was either familiar enough to be trusted or convincing enough to be believed. Trust does not require intimacy. It can arise from perceived authority, confidence, or routine. One possibility considered was that the women encountered someone presenting as legitimate, someone whose role did not invite suspicion. In everyday life, people respond differently to those who appear to belong. A uniform, a professional demeanor, or a confident explanation can lower defenses quietly. This kind of encounter would not require violence or urgency. It would require compliance born of assumption. Another possibility is familiarity through proximity. Neighborhoods create casual recognition. Faces become known without names. People feel comfortable opening doors for those they have seen before. If the women recognized someone from the area, even vaguely, the interaction may not have felt threatening enough to resist. It is also possible that the encounter was brief and subtle, not a confrontation, but a conversation, not a demand, but a request, something that did not register as dangerous in the moment. Many harmful events begin without appearing harmful at all. They unfold through small, ordinary exchanges that only reveal their significance later. Some have considered whether the women encountered someone by chance earlier in the evening. Graduation night involved movement, gatherings, and casual interaction. People crossed paths without note. A brief conversation, an introduction, or a shared moment could have established familiarity without leaving a lasting impression. If such a person later appeared at the house, the connection may have felt benign. What remains consistent across all interpretations is restraint. There is no indication of panic, no evidence of struggle, no sign that the women attempted to flee or alert others. This suggests that whatever occurred did not announce itself as a threat until it was too late to respond. The encounter, if there was one, likely relied on silence rather than force, cooperation rather than resistance. The absence of noise does not imply absence of fear, but it does suggest that fear did not arrive immediately. It arrived, if at all, after control had already been established. This understanding shifts focus away from dramatic scenarios and toward quieter ones. Not an intruder breaking in, but a door opening. Not a violent struggle, but a conversation interrupted. Not chaos, but compliance. And yet, even this framework does not identify a face. The person the women might have encountered remains undefined because the encounter itself left no mark. No witness observed it. No object recorded it. No sound carried beyond the walls of the house. It existed, if it existed at all, only in that private space, and then disappeared. This is what makes the question so enduring. It does not ask for a name. It asks for a moment, a brief intersection between ordinary lives and an unknown presence, a point where familiarity failed to protect and silence replaced explanation. In the absence of evidence, restraint remains necessary. Speculation without proof can cause harm, and certainty without foundation can distort truth. The encounter, whatever its nature, resists reconstruction, and so it remains imagined rather than known. A door that may have opened, a voice that may have spoken, a moment that passed without witness. Who they might have encountered remains unanswered, not because no one has considered it, but because the encounter itself left nothing behind, only absence, and absence, once settled, rarely gives up its shape. In the years since the disappearance, the house on East Delmar Street has continued to exist in the same way all houses do. It has sheltered new lives. It has held ordinary routines. From the outside, it gives no indication of what once slipped away inside it. The neighborhood remains quiet. The street remains familiar. Nothing marks the absence except memory. The case itself did not end. It softened. Without arrests, without answers, it gradually shifted from investigation to reflection. The urgency that once surrounded it faded, replaced by something steadier and more enduring. A quiet awareness that 3 lives vanished without explanation, and that the world continued moving forward anyway. This kind of ending is difficult to accept. There is no conclusion to reach for, no final chapter that resolves what came before. The story remains open, not because of neglect, but because it resists closure. Some questions do not narrow with time, they simply remain. For the families, the aftermath has been defined by uncertainty rather than grief alone. When there is no confirmation of loss, there is no clear place for mourning to settle. Hope and sorrow exist side by side, neither fully giving way to the other. Time passes, but it does not complete the story. For the community, the disappearance left a subtle imprint. It challenged assumptions about safety and familiarity. It introduced the idea that silence can carry consequence, that absence does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, without leaving behind anything to hold on to. What remains most striking is how little changed outwardly. There were no visible signs of violence, no physical damage to remember, no moment frozen in time, only the knowledge that something occurred without leaving a mark. In many cases, resolution comes through discovery. In this one, endurance takes its place. The story is carried forward through memory, through careful retelling, through restraint rather than speculation. It survives because people continue to hold space for it, not because it demands attention. And perhaps that is where it belongs. Not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a reminder that ordinary places can hold unanswered things, that familiar routines do not guarantee safety, that silence can be as meaningful as sound. As this story settles, there is nothing more required of it. You do not need to find answers. You do not need to imagine conclusions. You can let it rest, unresolved, as many things in life remain. The house is quiet again. The street has returned to routine, and the questions grow distant, not because they are forgotten, but because they are carried gently rather than forced. The night allows for that. And now, as the story fades, you are free to let your thoughts slow, to let the unanswered remain unanswered, and to rest in the stillness that follows.